Good morning and welcome to the 16th meeting in 2013 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. And can I first of all remind everyone present to please turn off any mobile phones or other electronic devices. We have received apologies this morning from committee member Michael McMahon. The first item on our agenda today is to decide whether to take item 4 in private. Are members agreed? Members have indicated their agreement. The second item of business today is to take evidence from the Scottish Government Bill team as part of our scrutiny of the Scottish Independence Referendum Bill's financial memorandum. Can I therefore welcome to the meeting Steve Sadler and Louise Unwin. Good morning. And I'd like one of you to please give a short opening statement.
Morning. Thank you, Convener. The financial memorandum which accompanies the Scottish Independence Referendum Bill sets out estimates of the administrative, oversight and other costs arising from the provisions of the bill. The costs are separated into 4 broad categories: the costs of running the referendum, the costs of funding the Electoral Commission for overseeing and regulating the referendum campaigns and reporting on the conduct of the referendum, the publicity costs incurred by the Commission in fulfilling its duty to provide information to voters about the referendum, and the costs of allowing the 2 campaign organisations a free mail shot to every voter or household in Scotland. The conduct of the poll and the announcement of the result will reflect the arrangements for local and parliamentary elections in Scotland and will be consistent with Scotland's electoral management structure. The poll and the count will be managed in the same way as those elections by local returning officers designated as counting officers for the referendum and directed by a chief counting officer who will be the convener of the Electoral Management Board. The Electoral Commission will be responsible for a range of regulatory and information tasks consistent with those it would carry out under a Political Parties Elections and Referendums Act based referendum. In its role of regulating the campaign and campaign spending, the Commission will report to the Scottish Parliament. The Edinburgh Agreement signed in October last year provides that designated campaign organisations should be able to send 1 mail shot free of charge to every elector or household and for the Royal Mail to recover the cost of postage from the Consolidated Fund. The estimated costs of the provisions made in the bill in line with these arrangements have been compiled with the assistance of stakeholders and in particular the Electoral Management Board, the Electoral Commission and the Royal Mail, and I'm grateful to them for their help in this. The financial memorandum explains the details behind the totals for running, regulating and reporting on the referendum and providing mail shots to campaign organisations. Obviously we're very happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that opening statement. As is normally the case, I'll start with a few questions and then committee members will come in due course. In terms of the Chief Accounting Officer, I noticed that the financial memorandum says it's not possible to give precise cost figures due to the fact it's not known how the CCO will decide to deliver its work, but for the purpose of estimating the cost of the referendum, these have been estimated in the region of around £300,000. I was just wondering if you can give us a bit more detail as to how that figure was arrived at.
Yes, of course. We've spoken to the bill provides that the Chief Counting Officer will be the convener of the Electoral Management Board, and that's Mary Pitt-Caithley, who's the Chief Executive of Falkirk Council. We've spoken to Mary and to the Secretary of the Management Board, showing them draft provisions of the bill outlined in the consultation document before the bill and the financial documents were published, and asked them for, based on those indicative proposals for setting out how they feel the role of Chief Counting Officer will be funded. So we received documents from the Secretary of the Electoral Management Board setting out various proposals. So it was based on information received from the board.
Okay, thank you very much. And in terms of the Electoral Management Board for Scotland, in their submission to the committee, they've said that, and I quote, the financial memorandum recognises the need for additional detailed consultation around the terms of the fees and charges order. This is vital. I'm just wondering what's happening in terms of that.
The fees and charges, well, the next meeting of the Electoral Management Board is this Friday afternoon, and I go along to that as an advisor to the board. The fees and charges order is an agenda item on that meeting, and what we're intending to do then is set out a timetable to develop the proposals for the fees and charges order. The bill gives Scottish ministers the order-making power to make the order, but what I've said to Electoral Management Board and other electoral administrators is that we will work with them between now and, well, over the summer, basically, to develop the contents of that based on comparable figures for things like the Scottish Parliament elections. So there'll be a range of costs that electoral administrators will identify as being necessary for the government to fund, and we will work to put those in a draft order.
Okay, thank you. And if we compare the cost of the referendum with other elections and referenda, the financial memorandum states that the closest comparator to help determine the likely cost of running the referendum is the parliamentary voting system referendum. But of course that was held on the same day as the Scottish Parliament elections. Is that a kind of, is that really a good comparison?
The fact that the Electoral Commission produced a very detailed report onto the costs associated with that referendum gave us some valuable background information on that. But as you're right, as you say, it was held on the same day as another event. In that Electoral Commission report, they also carried out a calculation which would identify the costs of us based on the kind of costs that they identified as having actually been spent in the referendum. They identified and gave an estimate rather for a standalone referendum in Scotland, and that's the figure that we've used in our financial memorandum. So we've used some of the detail from the DAV referendum report, but used again the Electoral Commission's almost extrapolation of that to say what would a standalone referendum in Scotland cost, and that's the figure that we base a lot of our work in the memorandum on.
Okay, now last year, of course, we had the Police and Crime Commissioner elections in England and Wales, which weren't particularly high profile, and the turnout was a fairly dismal 15.1%, which cost some in the region of £75 million, or about £14 for every vote cast. I'm just wondering if there's any lessons that's been learned by what happened south of the border last year, as well as the referendum in 2011 here in Scotland.
I think that there have been some, and we've had some discussions already with the Electoral Commission, because the Commission advised on the running of that referendum, largely around the issue of public awareness, I suppose, and giving publicity to the referendum. I think the Commission will be the first to admit that the sort of police commissioners or police crime commissioners referendum is likely, I'll put it the other way, a referendum on independence is likely to have a substantially higher public profile than for police commissioners. So that's one thing. But I think, again, working with the Commission, we will look to pick up ideas from them around public awareness to ensure that, or to the best we can, to encourage a higher turnout.
Okay, thank you. Now, just looking at the submission from Aberdeen City Council, which is a good one, and it talks about it cannot be guaranteed that all members of a household who are eligible to vote will see a household circulation, particularly if one member has strong views and chooses to suppress opposing material. And it says basically in conclusion that provision should be made for an individual address communication to be sent to each voter. Is that something which you feel should be the case? There are significant cost differentials.
Yes,
at 1.3 million, of course. But
there are significant cost differentials, and that's why what we've done in the memorandum and what the legislation will provide is that it will be for the designated organisations to choose which of the two methods of sending out material they prefer, whether to go for household or individually addressed, because the submission from Aberdeen City Council makes the point that others have said to us that it may well be cheaper, but there's a risk of one address not being passed around the house, for example. So I think what we're providing in the memorandum and the legislation is the choice, which is why there's the range of cost.
yes, indeed, and they will be the Scottish Government will be fully supportive of whichever choice is made.
Indeed, yes.
Which I think indeed would be that case. I'd be surprised if it wasn't. Just lastly, before I open the session up to colleagues, again in Aberdeen's submission it says timing is critical. A genuine nationwide sweep would presumably have to be conducted sufficiently early in the day to allow delivery at the end of the country. Now, this is a sweep of postal votes I'm talking about. Yeah, this would effectively only pick up those votes which should be delivered by normal post on polling day and do nothing in respect of those posted later that day or on polling day. This kind of comes out as a kind of recurrent theme through many of the submissions we've received. What's your view on that? I mean, I know there's an issue about holding the sweep early, but in doing so you don't actually catch everyone if it's held the day before? Would it not be perhaps better, as has been suggested, to have it on the polling day itself, or late on the day before?
It would, and I'm sorry that, I think we've in the last couple of days looked at the wording of the financial memorandum, and the intention is, I think in one paragraph we say it's the day before and then also the day of the poll, so I apologise for that. But you're right, I think the intention would be that the sweep would take place on the morning of the polling. And that's what's happened in previous elections. The details of that will be for the chief counting officer once in post, but I mean that would be the intention, the day of the poll.
Okay, thank you very much. Jamie.
Very much. Convener, just picking up on the convener's line of question there in terms of the options for the individual campaigns, whether they're individually addressed communications or per household. I mean, essentially that's no different from current electoral practice in any election now. That would be the choice for campaigns. Can you confirm that's the case?
That's right. I mean, and that picks up on one of the main points in the bill, is what we've tried to do in terms of running and regulating the referendum is to make it as close to the normal practice for an election as possible.
Okay, that's helpful. Can you just give me a sort of general sense of what the reaction to stakeholders and other interested parties have been to the estimates set out in the memorandum?
I think on the whole it's been supportive. The Electoral Management Board, for example, recognised that we've taken on the rough sort of quantum of their estimates. They've all said that what this document provides is a reasonable estimate of the likely cost this far out. Obviously we've got over a year to go before we get to the referendum, and they've also said they would also welcome continuing discussions with us over the detail of this. But I think we're pleased to see that most of them have welcomed the fact that we've taken on board their comments and had constructive and early discussions with them over this.
You referred to, Ms Sadler, to the likelihood that the turnout for the referendum will be significantly higher than that for the elections to police commissioners. I happen to agree with that perspective. Indeed, I think Western Bartonshire suggests that they expect the turnout to be higher than any election that we normally face in Scotland, and that could bring in terms of the requirement for additional polling stations, additional staff. Can you tell me how that's been factored into thinking?
One of the things we've done is, in discussing with the Electoral Management Board and others, for example, SOLAR, who represent local authority lawyers, they've gone through and been very helpful in going through the detail of the referendum proposals and the costs in the memorandum. But one of the things we've spoken to them about are the practicalities of all of this. And I think Gordon Blair gave evidence to the Referendum Bill Committee earlier this month, where he said that returning officers tend to plan for a normal election on the basis of a 70 to 80% turnout. So it's those sorts of figures that we've been using to produce estimates of cost.
So essentially the thinking is that it won't be that different from planning for another election in terms of turnout?
No, I suspect if you were to ask electoral administrators, they would say it will be at the higher end of that scale. That's what, that would be their guess, and that seems to be sort of academic commentators guessing, or estimating, I should say, the referendum turnout. But I think that's the working assumptions, that it will be towards the higher end of that scale.
And if it is identified that there's a need for additional polling stations, for example, because one of the things that you find when you're out campaigning is people get used to their polling stations. So if there are additional polling stations, that will presumably mean some people will be using different polling stations. Will that be factored into terms of making sure people are aware of that?
It would be, yes. Information around location of polling stations and allocation of voters to particular polling stations will be for local counting officers to decide. I think what we can say, though, is that when we're discussing the fees and charges order with returning officers and their representatives, we'll ensure that gives sufficient flexibility to give effect to their operational judgment, if you like, nearer the time of the referendum as to the amount of resource they would need for whether it's polling station ballot boxes or whatever.
Is it not, though, that although the number of polling stations might increase, the number of polling places is unlikely to change?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Gavin, to be followed by Joan.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions. The Royal Mail, in their written submission to the committee, said that they provided, I suppose, their best estimate based on what they knew. But they've stated However, we were not asked to provide potential costs for delivery of poll cards or ballot pack mailing. So I just wonder, are those costs that have been factored in somewhere else, or is that something that will have to be added to this financial memorandum? And if so, is there any idea what that might be?
Those costs have been factored into the costs of local counting officers, because counting officers or returning officers for elections are responsible for that task. So they would be, the costs for that will be in with the returning officers' costs.
And the other question I wanted to ask, the electoral, Convener asked you about the assumption of costs from the UK 2011 referendum. The Electoral Management Board in their submission said there has been some concern expressed that such an extrapolation is not appropriate. While it may give a general overall cost, it may underestimate in some classes of cost and in some areas, and the only appropriate model would be one in which costs are built up from first principles. In terms of any underestimates, is it your view that those underestimates would be at the margins and that the overall cost would be broadly similar, or are there some risks in there where there could be big underestimates?
No, it's our view that the estimates that we have in the financial memorandum will be of the a rough order of that. We're not expecting huge sways either up or down. I think we've used the detail of the 2011 referendum costs, but we've also used the Electoral Commission's calculation about what a standalone referendum would be. I saw that the Electoral Management Board said that some concern had been raised about that, and you've seen evidence from a couple of particular councils, but I think the general view of the board, in the fact that it represents all 32 returning officers, is that we're pretty much, it's a good estimate that we've provided.
So, thank you. John, to be followed by Jean.
Thanks so much. I felt there was a different kind of angle that the Electoral Commission took from the Council responses, in that the Electoral Commission kind of stressed that it was only its marginal expenditure which expected to be reimbursed, and it talks about temporary staff, but we do not intend to seek reimbursement in respect of those existing staff who are working on the referendum. Whereas the Council seemed to want every single penny that is in any way related to running the referendum, even though some of it is effectively existing staff salaries. Which is right, or are they both right?
Because I work with them both, I'm going to say they're both right. But I think the Electoral Commission, I think, have taken the view that they have resource in their Scotland office, which provides advice to the government and others normally on the running of elections, and will continue to do so, based on the referendum. So I think what they're saying, what they've said to me, is that they won't be looking to apportion any part of their salaries or their office costs, if you like, to the referendum. What the Commission say is, obviously they will need to be reimbursed for the money they spend on a public awareness campaign, and that's obvious. The specific guidance that is produced to counting officers or whoever will again need to be reimbursed. So it is what they call marginal costs, it's sort of over and above. I think in terms of the returning officers or the counting officers, the discussions we will have with them will identify what specific actions they need to take to prepare for and run the referendum, put those in the fees and charges order, and then expect them to show how much they've spent against those particular headings as and when it comes to reimburse them.
Because in some cases, am I right in saying that there's some quite well-paid officers therefore paid extra for actually running any election or referendum?
Returning officers receive a fee, yes, I suppose in recognition of the personal contribution they take and the personal responsibility they take for running the referendum.
Okay, thanks. And the contrast to that is the Electoral Management Board, who, as I understand it, have no resources of their own whatsoever. So whatever their costs are, absolutely have to be. Is there more therefore of a risk there that if they overspend or anything, we would have to carry the can, or the government would have to?
For the Electoral Management Board?
Yes.
Well, the board was set up 2, possibly 3 years ago, largely as a coordinating body. It brings together representatives of the returning officers. So although the Scottish Government provides some relatively minor funding for sort of the running of the board as a coordination role, that's where we've got to at the moment. in its role as supporting the Chief Counting Officer for the referendum, we've obviously recognised that it will need to have resource. It will need to take on perhaps a project manager, a communications person, whatever, and they are factored into the Chief Counting Officer costs. And we've said to, I mean, we've been having preliminary discussions with Mary Pitt-Caithley already. I would hope that she's comfortable with the assurances we've given her that we will come to an agreement about what she and the board need to do, and we will provide the funding for that.
Now, on the number of people voting, I mean, I think we're accepting that it's going to be extra, although, if I understand it correctly, the fact that 16 and 17-year-olds are voting would really make very, very little difference. The question would be more of the turnout. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the estimate we have it will be between 100 and 120,000 potential younger voters going onto the register. So, I mean, sorry, in the overall total, it's a couple of percent.
I mean, the point was made earlier about extra polling stations. I mean, sadly, the case is in Glasgow that we've got lots of polling stations that just sit there very, very quietly all day, and the poor officers are pulling their hair out. So presumably, in that situation, there will not be any extra costs because you could double or triple the turnout and it still wouldn't be busy. So will there be some supervision of councils as to whether they really need extra costs or whether they can do it within their normal costs?
There will be, yes, and I think what the fees and charges order will do is produce almost like a menu, if you like, of costs that returning officers can claim depending on how many polling stations, polling places or whatever, how much printing they need to do. And I think we will need to be, once we've agreed the order, we will then need to have discussions through the Electoral Management Board, individual returning officers to say, as you say, one of the things we will be looking at is sort of not past performance but past experience in particular areas of whether it's turnout, and if a particular set of polling places I suppose historically has a very low turnout, then we would be saying, well, you could still increase the turnout quite significantly and manage within those resources. But they're the discussions that would need to take place. Yes, you're right.
On Royal Mail, they kind of commented that some of their costs were not predictable, which I found a little bit hard to understand because it seems to me, well, what we normally call election addresses or whatever that are delivered by them are pretty much always the same size and pretty much always the same weight and that kind of thing. Do you understand why they were saying it wasn't predictable?
I mean, there's a section in their evidence where the Royal Mail say they would have preferred to have provided us with a specific quote based on particular definite specifications. I think the discussions that we've had, in particular Louisa's had with the Royal Mail, have centred around these are the proposals in the bill, this is what's likely to happen. We can have more concrete discussions with you as the bill goes through its parliamentary process, possibly as early as after stage 1 approval was given to the bill. And so I think there's that difference. What's coming out is a difference between what we're looking to do in the terms of a traditional financial memorandum, which is provide the best evidence or best estimates we can this far away from an event of what things are likely to cost, with the Royal Mail looking at it as if we were to have this contract, this would be the specification and this would be, we would give you, through discussion, we would give you a cost. So I think that's the kind of, when they're saying they would like, some of their costs could be more certain, I think it's that difference in approaches that's at issue here, rather than anything else.
Okay, and I mean, this sweep that they carry out, I mean, can you explain to us what that actually means? I mean, is it because they've dropped some of their mail behind a cabinet or something, they have to go and look for it? Or, I mean, what are they actually doing that they don't normally do? I
think what they do is, I mean, polling day will be on a Thursday. The mail, any post that comes in after the post is left, frankly, for that day, would normally be delivered on the Friday. Now, if there are postal votes that have happened, obviously arriving at the returning officer on a Friday is no good. So after the normal sort of cut-off date for delivery or pick-up, if you like, on that day, Post Office sorting offices, as I understand it, will produce what they call a sweep to see what else has come in. And I don't think there are huge numbers involved, but I think obviously it's important to get as many votes as possible counted and delivered.
I mean, I'm not an expert in the postal service, but I mean, it seems to me that, if there's hundreds of thousands of bits of mail sitting there, pulling out 1 or 2 postal votes is going to be actually quite hard.
Nice coloured envelopes.
Yes, I'm sure it is. But all I can say on that is this: I'm told this happens before every election or on the day of every election, and what returning officers will be discussing with their local post office is to do that again on the day of the referendum.
And would that include somewhere like Carlisle, where people might post, Scottish people might post mail?
I'm not sure, though, to be honest. I would have assumed that it's mostly in Scottish postal sorting offices or whatever, but I mean we would need to find out about that, and we can let you know, but I'm not sure I know the exact detail of that, I'm afraid.
Thanks so much.
Okay, Jean?
Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to ask about the cost of printing the ballot paper, which I presume the cost of the actual ballot paper is wrapped up in the polling station cost stationery. Is that right? And I wanted to know if there had been consideration given to printing the ballot paper in Scots and Gaelic as well as English.
The bill currently provides for the ballot paper just to be produced in English.
And there would be very little extra cost to printing that in 2 other languages, would there?
I think in terms of cost, it may not be significant. I think some of the comments we've had from returning officers and the Electoral Commission talk about complications in other ways that could be produced. What will happen is that returning officers and the Electoral Commission will produce explanatory material both for polling stations, polling places, and in advance of the poll in Gaelic and other languages.
Do you know what the complications were? Can you?
Well, I mean, not offhand. Sorry.
What were the disadvantages or the complications the reasons for that?
One of the things the Electoral Commission said is that they obviously only tested the ballot paper in English. So that was one complication. Returning officers had said it would add to the complications of the counting process. I haven't got the material they've given to me on this, I'm afraid, but it was partly on advice from returning officers and others.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That appears to have completed the questions from the committee. Oh no, sorry. Apologies, Malcolm.
Well, I think most of the
Really
issues have been covered, but I mean, I was particularly struck by what others have referred to, the financial memorandum statement about the closest comparator being the parliamentary voting system referendum, and Gavin Brown quoted what I thought was really a very strong critique from the Electoral Management Board. So I suppose I was curious to know, just the extent to which that comparator had been influential, or whether, because I mean, I would have concerns if it was, because it seems to have been widely criticised by lots of local authorities as well. It seems to be that, in fact, the commonest source of criticism that I could see in the responses.
I'm not sure it's been widely criticised. It's been criticised by a number of people who have responded to the committee, but I'm not sure how many responses, but the Electoral Management Board, who we've been dealing with and who helped us to compile our estimates in the memorandum, represent all 32 returning officers. And I think broadly what the board have said to us is that, as I say, the detail of the PVS information from the Electoral Commission is one thing. It provides useful headings, but then we've taken that another step by looking at the Electoral Commission's prediction of a standalone cost, and that's the basis of our thing, not necessarily the joint holding of a referendum on the date of elections. But again, what I would emphasise is something the Electoral Management Board have picked up, is that we're using that as a decent estimate of the costs now, and we're committed, and they've accepted and are grateful, happy with the discussions that we're about to have over the detail of the fees and charges order to develop specific costs, and with local variations necessary, as some of the people who have responded to the committee have pointed out.
I mean, one similarity with the parliamentary voting system referendum obviously is that you can place orders far in advance because you don't need to wait for nominations. But Aberdeen Council said, well, that's all well and good, but then you'll have to warehouse the ballot papers in secure conditions for a period of weeks or months, and they wondered whether the costs of that had been factored in.
Not the costs of warehousing ballot papers, no, because I think what we've done at the moment is we've gone on existing practice. Now, the Electoral Management Board, I understand, are going to consider whether they could under the auspices of the Chief Counting Officer, order ballot papers centrally or well in advance. And that's something that the board, picking up on the views of individual returning officers, will consider and discuss with us, I imagine, in terms of the cost that we provide for that.
Just on the back of what Malcolm has actually said, I mean, you know, when Aberdeen Council talk about, you know, necessitating the papers in warehouse in secure condition for a period of weeks or months, I take it they would be centrally stored and then just issued out to the local authorities much closer to the polling day, if that was to happen.
I would have thought so. I mean, I'm just trying to think. I mean, there was, if go back to last year in local government elections, there were various electoral documents that were produced, and some were produced in advance, but they were stored centrally and then issued more locally shortly before the election. Yes, it's difficult to envisage how this might happen, but I suspect that if a central contract was let a long time in advance for this, part of that may well be the secure storage of the ballot papers until returning officers were ready to take receipt of them.
I mean, what kind of savings would we be talking about anyway in terms of this?
I'm not sure.
Significant margin?
I doubt they were hugely significant. And also I think that there's a feeling among returning officers that I've picked up that they're actually happier with their local printers because they've developed a relationship with them, they know they can trust them. And I think, not surprisingly, they'd be anxious that they're going to get things on time, because it's no good getting ballot papers the day after, obviously. So I think a lot of returning officers that I've spoken to have said there may well be the possibility of some savings, but against that they would have to sort of weigh up their relationship and the trust and confidence they have in local providers.
Okay, just moving on to a couple of other things. In terms of its submission, the Commonwealth and Aileen Shar has said that the Outer Hebrides would require specific financial support with the organisation of the election count. If, for example, there to be an insistence on the count being held overnight, we should require use of a helicopter to carry ballot boxes from Uist and Barra to Lewis, the only alternative being two separate count centres. I mean, my own constituents would be affected similarly, as would Argyll, Butte and others. You know, Shetland, Orkney come to mind. I'm just wondering whether a decision has been made on that particular issue as yet.
On the issue of overnight
counting, yes.
My understanding is that the intention is to count overnight. It's obviously a matter for once she's imposed the Chief Counting Officer. But as I say, the discussions we've had with returning officers suggest that they're planning at this early stage for an overnight count. And I think what we've had to strengthen that is I've had some discussions with Mary Pitcaithley about what central support or otherwise might be needed for certain constituencies, areas, to ensure that they could cope with that. And that obviously local circumstances may need, whether it's helicopters or multiple count centres or something. And again, the Electoral Management Board are looking at this, and I'm expecting to have discussions with them over the next few months.
Okay, and is there any cost estimates of what that would actually be in terms of servicing kind of rural areas?
Sorry, no. Part of that process is the board will be asking the 32 returning officers for an assessment of, first of all, whether they feel they would be comfortable counting overnight, and if they were to count overnight, whether that would require any additional expense over and above what they would do for a normal election. The board are in that sort of evidence gathering process now, as I understand it, and that's when we'll need to have discussions with them.
Okay, and when will this be concluded?
It will be raised, I imagine, on Friday, but I don't suppose it won't be concluded at this Friday's meeting. But I mean, I would hope. I think the board in general and the Chief Counting Officer designate are looking to have a project manager in place for the electoral administration side of all of this sometime over the summer. So I would imagine one of the first tasks of that person would be to look at arrangements for overnight counting.
Okay, thank you. Now, in terms of the postal voting checks, the proposals to increase these to 100%, is that correct? And the likely introduction of 100% of personal identifiers will increase costs, say South Lanarkshire Council. Again, what kind of additional costings would we be talking about across Scotland?
I think what's happened at the moment is that the legislation up to now has provided for less than 100% of checks, but that registration officers have, wherever possible, actually carried out 100% checks, and that's something that the Electoral Commission recommend they should be doing. So most registration officers do that already.
we know what the kind of average is at the moment, what the, you know, because I mean, obviously you can look at the, if you know what the average is now, and you can look at the additional costs that may have to be.
Those figures with me, but my understanding is it's a performance indicator from the Electoral Commission for returning officers that they should aim for 100%.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I mean, that appears to be all the questions from the committee this morning, so I'd like to thank you both very much for your attendance and your response to our questions. Thank you.
Suspend for a minute or two till we change it.
Sure, I'm going to suspend actually for a few minutes. We're ahead of schedule, and we obviously have to change things as well. Well, it's supposed to be 10:30. Okay, folks, the Cabinet Secretary is now here, so we'll therefore reconvene the session. And the third item of business is Stage 2, consideration of the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Scotland Bill. We are joined for this by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth, and I welcome him to the meeting, along with Neil Ferguson, John Sinclair and Matt Lynch of the Scottish Government. Members should note that as officials cannot speak on the record at Stage 2, all questions should be directed to the Cabinet Secretary. Now, members should have the marshalled list of amendments and the groupings. And I'd like to just give some information prior to the commencement so that everyone knows the kind of ground rules of the session we're about to commence on. There will be one debate on each group of amendments, and I will call the member who lodged the first amendment in that group to speak to and move that amendment and to speak to their amendments in the group. Members who have not lodged amendments in the group but who wish to speak should indicate that by catching my attention in the normal fashion. If he has not already spoken on the group, I'll invite the Cabinet Secretary to contribute to the debate just before I move to the winding up speech. The debate on the group will be concluded by me inviting the member who moved the first amendment in the group to wind up. Following debate on each group, I'll check whether the member who moved the first amendment in that group wishes to press it to a vote or withdraw it. If they wish to press ahead, I'll put the question on that amendment. If a member wishes to withdraw their amendment after it has been moved, they must seek the committee's agreement to do so. If any committee member objects, the committee immediately moves to the vote on the amendment. Finally, if any member doesn't want to move their amendment when called, they should say not moved. And please note that any other MSP may move such an amendment, and if no one moves that amendment, I'll immediately call the next amendment on the marshalled list. Okay, let's press ahead. So, we move on to Section 1, Collection and Management of the Tax. I call Amendment 1 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary and a group of his own. Cabinet Secretary to move and speak to the amendment.
Thank you, Convener. This is a minor and technical amendment to Section 1.3 of the Bill to change the reference to care and management of LBTT to collection and management. The two terms have the same meaning in law. Collection and management appears in the Scotland Act 2012 and the Landfill Tax Scotland Bill, and will appear in the Tax Management Scotland Bill in due course. The amendment before the committee is therefore for consistency of terminology only. I move Amendment 1.
Okay. Anyone else? And Cabinet Secretary to wind up?
No comments.
No, okay. The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Members have indicated the agreement. The question is that Section 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Members have indicated their agreement. The question is that Sections 2 and 3 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Colleagues have indicated their agreement. I call Amendment 2 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendment 3. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 2 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. I'll speak to Amendments 2 and 3. The first of these amendments replaces the reference to interest, right or power with the terms real rights or other interest in the definition of chargeable interest in Section 4.2a of the Bill. This will align the definition better with Scots law terminology. It is not intended to change what is or what is not a chargeable interest in Scotland. Amendment 3 is consequential on Amendment 2 and replaces the words interest, right or power with right or interest in Section 4.2b. I would like to thank Professor Ken Reid of the University of Edinburgh and Alan Barr of the Law Society of Scotland for working with officials to ensure that the bill reflects Scots property law as effectively as we can. And I would therefore move Amendment 2, Convener.
Gavin Brown.
Thank you, Convener. I think in terms of Amendment 2, I think the addition of the phrase real right is to be welcomed, and it does represent Scots law. So I think in that respect, getting rid of interest, right or power is the right thing to do. I just have a simple question, though, about the expression other interests. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary in winding up is in a position to define that term. It's not one that I recognise, and I just wonder if the Government is willing to speak to experts after Stage 2 to see if there is a way of getting a slightly sharper definition. Some practitioners have described the expression other interest as amorphous to me, and I just wonder if there's a way. Well, I think the amendment is better than what's there, what it replaces. I just wonder if there's a way of getting even something even slightly better when we come to Stage 3.
To wind up.
In terms of the terminology other interest, what is in our mind is to put in place terminology that will enable an application to be determined of within the scope of chargeable interest. So it's not a, the other interest is not being inserted into the terminology to create any form of catch-all provision. It is purely and simply to provide some further definition within the context of the definition of chargeable interest for the purposes of this section of the bill. So I would certainly assure Mr Brown that the terminology has not been used in any way to create a catch-all provision. It is entirely within the parameters of chargeable interest.
Okay, the question is that Amendment 2 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Members have indicated the agreement. I call Amendment 3 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 2. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Formally moved, Convener.
The question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are all agreed. The question is that Section 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. The question is that Sections 5 to 16 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 4 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary group with Amendments 5, 6, 30 and 32. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 4 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. The bill at introduction provided that all licences to occupy non-residential property should be included in the scope of the tax. Having reflected further on the evidence the committee has heard during stage 1 of the bill process, these proposed amendments seek to limit the taxation of licences by means of a delegated power in the bill. Amendment 4 therefore amends Schedule 1 so that all transactions relating to licences, except non-residential licences prescribed under the new section added by Amendment 30, are exempt transactions. Amendment 30 provides for a power to specify, by means of subordinate legislation, particular types of licences that are land transactions and will therefore be subject to the tax. This power will give the flexibility needed to provide for additional exceptions at a later date more easily, should it prove necessary to do so. Amendment 32 makes provision in Section 67 of the Bill for the regulations about prescribed non-residential licences to be subject to the affirmative procedure, allowing for full parliamentary scrutiny of the proposed regulations. Amendments 5 and 6 are consequential amendments to Section 1 of the Bill. Convener, in its written evidence to the committee, the Law Society indicated that it, and I quote, broadly supports the proposal for licences not to be treated as exempt interests so that LBTT will be payable if there is a consideration for the grant of a licence. However, it also suggested that, and I quote, further consideration needs to be given whether certain categories of licences do merit exemption from LBTT. For various reasons, the occupation of certain types of retail property is made under licence rather than by means of a lease. These may include retail units in airports and retailers using space within larger shops like department stores and supermarkets. Based on value, these are the licences most likely to incur land and buildings transaction tax and are the main types of licences I have in mind for including in regulations as being within the scope of the tax. I would move Amendment 4.
Okay. Gavin?
Grateful, Convener. I mean, clearly the committee felt that licences broadly shouldn't be included, and I'm grateful that the Cabinet Secretary has taken much of that on board. Just a question around Amendment 30, though. It allows the government to outline by regulation which licences would be caught by the bill. When the government produced its written response to the committee Stage 1 report, response number 6, the Scottish Government said, Scottish Government has carefully considered the evidence presented to the committee by a range of witnesses, intends to bring forward an amendment at Stage 2 that will set out which licences are within the scope of the tax. So I'm just wondering if the Cabinet Secretary is winding up is able to say where the government is in relation to that, and do we have an idea of what licences will be within the scope of the tax, and will that be outlined more clearly at Stage 3, or will it be after at Stage 3?
Sorry,
I'm just, it's okay, there's no other colleagues. I was just about to say Cabinet Secretary to wind up.
Thank you, Kabir. On Mr Brown's point, I think we will not define during the passage of the bill the type of licences that would be considered under LBTT. We will do that quite separately under secondary legislation, as Amendment 30 suggests. The comment I made just in the last part of my remarks related very much to the category. I've looked, when I was here before, the committee raised with me the evidence from the Law Society, which I have now looked at, the supplementary evidence that the Law Society provided to the committee, which went through a whole variety of different possibilities that could be considered for has been relevant under LBTT. Having gone through that list, I would have to say without saying absolutely this is my definitive position, I think the most likely candidates are going to be retail units within airports and shops within shops. But I would want to just reserve my position until the regulations come forward on exactly what a definition will be applied. But it will be within, we have decided to go for essentially a position that opts everything out and then opts in, as opposed to trying to opt lots of provisions out as a consequence of which would have been the case in the original bill as introduced. So I think this is administratively clearer and more efficient, but of course there will be consultation and consideration around the secondary legislation that emerges on this issue.
Okay, thank you. The question is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. Call Amendment 5 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 4. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved, Convener.
The question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. I call Amendment 6 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 4. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved, Convener.
The question is that Amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. The question is that Schedule 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. The question is that Section 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
I call Amendment 7 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 8, 9, 10 and 11. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 7 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Convener, Amendments 8, 10 and 11 set out a revised approach to calculating the chargeable consideration for exchanges of property. Amendment 8 clarifies that the chargeable consideration should be the greater of either the market value of the property or what the chargeable consideration would be in the absence of the rules of exchanges. This would include VAT where applicable. These amendments bring the bill into line with the way in which chargeable consideration for exchanges of property is calculated under Stamp Duty Land Tax, reflecting changes made by the Finance Act 2011, Schedule 21, Paragraph 4 to 5 of Schedule 4 to Finance Act 2003. Amendments 7 and 9 correct a minor drafting error in two places in Schedule 2, subparagraphs 3A and 3B of Paragraph 5. The terms relevant transaction and relevant transactions have been used instead of, respectively, relevant acquisition and relevant acquisitions. Amendments 7 and 9 resolve this issue, and I would move Amendment 7.
Okay, anything further in winding up, Cabinet Secretary?
No, Convener.
The question is that Amendment 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. I call Amendments 8, 9, 10 and 11, all in the name of the Cabinet Secretary and all previously debated. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendments 8 to 11 en bloc.
Moved en bloc, Convener.
Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 8 to 11? No member disagrees. Therefore, the question is that Amendments 8 to 11 agreed. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. The question is that Schedule 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. The question is that Sections 18 to 27 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
And we are. The question is that Schedules 3 to 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
I call Amendment 12 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 24, 25 and 31. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 12 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. In considering the need for these amendments, my objective is to provide a similar tax outcome in relation to land and buildings transaction tax for alternative finance investment bonds as for their equivalent conventional finance product. Land and buildings transaction tax is a charge on the acquisition of a chargeable interest in land or property situated in Scotland. Issuing a conventional bond secured on a building does not give rise to any land and buildings transaction tax liability. The investor does not have a direct ownership share in the underlying asset, but merely an interest-bearing certificate. Under an alternative finance investment bond, however, the investor owns part of the underlying asset, and interests in land and property in Scotland may be used as that asset. Amendment 12 therefore provides for a replacement to Schedule 8 of the Bill that will provide that no tax will be charged when the land is sold to the issuer of the alternative property investment bond, nor on the sale back of the land of the originator at the end of the bond term, and no LBTT will arise on the issue, transfer or redemption of the alternative property investment bonds. The new Schedule 8 substantially replicates Schedule 61 to Finance Act 2009 insofar as it relates to stamp duty land tax. Amendments 24, 25 and 31 are consequential technical amendments that adjust the bill to fit in better with the style and approach of the new Schedule 8. I would move Amendment 12.
Evan?
Thanks, Convener. In relation to the previous Schedule 8, or the Schedule 8 as it stands, Convener, in the interpretation section at page 54 of the bill, paragraph clause 5 on that, near the top of that page, it says, in the schedule, alternative finance investment bond means arrangements to which section 564G of Income Tax Act 2007 or section 151N of the Taxation of Chargeable Gains Act 1992 applies. In the amendment by the Cabinet Secretary, Clause 2 of his amendment gives a definition, a new definition of alternative finance investment bond. It's similar to the previous one, except it no longer seems to include section 151N of the Taxation of Chargeable Gains Act 1992. I'll just be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary, in his summing up, can just explain the implications of not having that particular clause in there anymore. That's all.
Cabinet Secretary to wind up.
The issue that Mr Brown raises, the definition is the same in both provisions, for the sake of efficiency we've referred to the one provision which covers, which essentially conveys the definition that in the original proposition was the same in both instruments. I've nothing further to add.
The question is that Amendment 12 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are all agreed. The question is that Schedules 9 to 12 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. I call Amendment 13 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary and a group of its own. Cabinet Secretary to move and speak to the amendment.
Thank you, Convener. The Scottish Government's response to the Finance Committee Stage 1 report advised that the Government was actively working with the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator and Revenue Scotland to consider the best approach to take regarding the charity relief qualifying requirements for the small number of organisations who buy but do not occupy property in Scotland purely as an investment, and to use the profits from this investment for charitable purposes. I am pleased to be able to say that as a result of that constructive dialogue, I am able to speak to the amendment before the committee today. Amendment 13 to the bill means that a body can claim charity relief if they are registered as a charity with the Scottish Charity Regulator, or if they are a body established under a law of a relevant territory and are managed or controlled wholly or mainly out with Scotland, subject to certain conditions. The conditions are that where the relevant territory has a charity regulatory regime, the body is registered with the charity regulator, or if the body is not so registered, that the body's purposes are exclusively charitable. To protect the tax base, charity relief will be restricted in the case of bodies not entered in the Scottish Charity Register to a relevant territory, England and Wales, Northern Ireland, a member state of the European Union other than the United Kingdom, or a territory specified in regulation made by the Scottish Ministers. I move Amendment 13.
Okay, Jamie to be followed by Malcolm.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, I suppose this wasn't particularly expected to be a big issue, but we did take some considerable evidence at stage 1. I think there were 2 issues identified that may be felt to be somewhat in competition with one another. There was obviously the need for simplicity and not to be an onerous requirement on charities, and on the other hand the need to ensure the bona fide credentials of or charitable credentials of organisations that are based out with Scotland, because essentially I suppose this is a subsidy by the taxpayer in Scotland to those organisations. And I accept there's not going to be many such cases, but obviously we have to get it right, and I think this amendment broadly does this. So I would just like to congratulate the government on coming up with something that's sensible. Hopefully we can support that.
Thank you, Mark.
I would also like to welcome this amendment. I think it is an effective way of dealing with the problems that were highlighted in terms of the original proposition. Just a couple of questions, really. I suppose the first one is who is going to be the judge of these conditions? I mean, is this going to be a role for Oscar, or will this just be something that the Scottish Government decides? And I suppose secondly, I'm kind of intrigued by a territory specified in regulations made by the Scottish ministers, and I suppose at the moment you can't really say which those territories might be, but I just wondered what the government might have in mind in terms of how that particular sub-clause might be applied in future.
Cabinet Secretary to wind up.
In terms of the, I welcome Mr Hepburn's comments in relation to the government's attempts to try to resolve this issue, and also Mr Chisholm's comments on this question. In relation to the determination of this issue, that would be a role that, in terms of whether an organisation satisfied the test that we're applying in the bill, would be exercised by Revenue Scotland in determining whether or not there was a tax liability to be applied. I don't foresee this being determined by Oscar. Oscar will make that judgment about charities in Scotland in fulfilment of their priorities, but we would be looking to Revenue Scotland to implement or to apply this legislation in the judgment around eligibility for tax. In relation to Mr Chisholm's final point about a territory specified in regulations made by the Scottish ministers, we essentially have in mind countries essentially on the periphery of the European Union, so most likely to be Norway and Iceland, I would imagine. But obviously there is a requirement for those regulations to be scrutinised when they come forward.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are all agreed. The question is that Schedule 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. I call Amendment 14 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, group with Amendments 15, 16, 17 and 18. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 14 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Convener, this group of amendments widens the availability of compulsory purchase order relief to local authorities in accordance with the intentions set out in the policy memorandum of the bill. Of this group of 5 amendments, Amendment 17 is the most substantive, and I will speak to Amendment 17 before turning my attention to Amendments 14, 15, 16 and 18. The bill at introduction reflected the current approach to stamp duty land tax, where the local authority does not pay tax if it purchases land or property through a compulsory purchase order with the intention of transferring it to a third party to facilitate development. Amendment 17 changes the qualifying condition for the relief in paragraph 3 of Schedule 14 to ensure that the relief is available to a local authority when it exercises its compulsory purchase order powers for any of the purposes stated in Section 189 of the Town and Country Planning Scotland Act 1997. These purposes are the development, redevelopment or improvement of land or any other purpose which it is necessary to achieve in the interest of the proper planning of an area in which the land is situated. Amendments 14, 15 and 16 restrict the availability of the relief to local authorities on the basis that acquisitions by the Scottish ministers or a minister of the Crown are already exempt under paragraph 2 of Schedule 1. Amendment 18 is consequential on Amendment 17 and deletes the definition of development in paragraph 5 of Schedule 14. I move Amendment 14.
Thanks. I support these amendments, Convener. Just in relation to Amendment 17, I thought the Cabinet's explanation there was quite helpful. But prior to hearing his explanation, simply reading his amendment and then reading in detail section 189 of the Town and Country Planning Scotland Act 1997, I just wondered if there was potential for confusion there, given the breadth and depth of that particular section. And I just simply posed to him, is there a way of, would he be willing to look at that section again, just to see if there's a way of having a slightly sharper or clearer definition for people looking at the legislation?
Cabinet Secretary to wind up.
Certainly, I'll happily undertake to look at that before stage 3 and determine whether the reference there is essentially too broad in terms of just the reference to the clause, and whether or not perhaps some of the language that I have used today around the development, redevelopment or improvement of land or any other purpose which is necessary to achieve, etc., might actually be more helpful to specify that on the face of the bill. But we'll certainly reflect on that issue in advance of stage 3 proceedings.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. I call Amendments 15, 16, 17 and 18 all in the name of the Cabinet Secretary and all previously debated. I invite Cabinet Secretary to move Amendments 15 to 18 en bloc.
Moved en bloc.
And does any member have object to a single question being put on Amendments 15 to 18? No one does. So the question is that Amendments 15 to 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. The question is that Schedule 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. The question is that Schedules 15 and 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. I call Amendment 33 in the name of Malcolm Chisholm, grouped with Amendment 34. Malcolm to move Amendment 33 and speak to both amendments in the group.
I think everyone in this Parliament is very strongly committed to achieving the climate change targets, and the two greatest emitters are transport and housing, and I think we all recognise that urgent action is required in both of those areas. Now, I'm not presenting these amendments as a panacea, but I do believe that they would make a useful contribution in relation to homes, and in particularly in relation to existing homes where we have the biggest problem of poor energy efficiency. And now, to those of you who think that this is a novel approach to taxation, I would actually invoke an example in the transport area that was enacted fairly recently by the UK government, where they legislated for a variation in vehicle excise duty based on the amount of CO2 that an engine emits. I think the problem that the UK government is running into with that particular piece of legislation is that it's being too effective, and that they're actually losing tax on it because it's having such an effect in incentivising drivers to have lower CO2 engines. So these amendments address that particular worry, because I can see that the Cabinet Secretary's main worry around this might be loss of revenue, and therefore the idea of tax neutrality is built into the main amendment here. In other words, there would be winners and there would be losers based on the energy efficiency of the home at the point of sale. Now, let's try and be a bit more concrete so to illustrate what exactly the amendments have in mind. Currently, there is an energy performance certificate issued when a house is sold, and there's already a score on that certificate out of 100. So if, I think the median point, the median SAP point, I think it would be called, at present is 60. Obviously, that will change as homes improve their energy efficiency, but just for the sake of example, if a house had a SAP point that was 1 point above 60, then perhaps they would get a 0.5% reduction in the LBBT, and equally if it was 1 point below the median of 60, they might get a 0.5% increase in the tax. But now those are merely illustrative, because of course these amendments really point towards regulations where the details can be put in. So that's illustrative rather than what would necessarily happen. But the point is that it's actually pretty easy to implement, because we already have a score on the energy performance certificate. So the adjusted LBBT could be really calculated in a moment of seconds, probably instantaneously, by a computer. So I don't think there would be any practical difficulties about establishing an adjusted LBBT. In order to achieve the tax neutrality, of course, and again, this would be the benefit of regulations, you would have to change that median point from year to year, and that could be done whenever it was required, so that you always achieved tax neutrality, and that those who gained would be netted off by those who lost. So I do think it would be easy to implement, and believe that it would make a significant contribution towards making people far more conscious of the energy efficiency of their homes. Now, clearly, it's in people's interests, which makes housing potentially a lot easier than transport to deal with. It is in people's interests to have higher energy efficiency, because self-evidently it will reduce their fuel bills. But we know that it's not uppermost in people's minds at present when they buy a house. And I think this would help to move people in the direction of being more aware of it and taking it more seriously, so that if someone was selling their house and it had a high energy performance rating, not only would the buyer get a discount on their LBBT, they would also, of course, have the benefit of lower energy bills when they bought the house. And in terms of the seller, they would be in a position where they might well get more for their house because it was more attractive to the buyer, and they might well sell it more quickly, because obviously it would have an advantage in the market over houses that were lower energy efficiency and higher LBBT. So I think, I'm not claiming, as I said at the beginning, that it would be a panacea, but I think it would make a significant contribution to changing the mindset of people with reference to the energy efficiency of homes. And while people may think that, well, I don't think people will think it's not important, but people might think it's not the most important thing when you're buying a house from the point of view of climate change. It probably is the most important thing that you can do when you buy your house. So this is really a climate change amendment, let's be honest about it, but we are absolutely committed to these targets and objectives through the Climate Change Act. So we have to take a range of measures to make sure that we realise those targets. Now, I think when we discussed this before, the Cabinet Secretary referred to the discount on council tax and said, well, he preferred that approach. They're not mutually exclusive. We need to do both. And in fact, if people say, well, why is the discount on the council tax not working better? Well, that should be explored, and we should perhaps take action to make it more effective. But we need to have a range of measures, including financial incentives, to ensure that the energy efficiency of the housing stock is raised. Now, because the detail of this is left to regulations, clearly there can be different approaches to the detail of it. I gave an example of how the increases and reductions might work earlier on. A further variant, which could easily be included in regulations, is to give people an opportunity, once they have bought a house, to get a rebate within the first 12 months if they then do the energy efficiency work. Now, clearly that would have an effect on the neutral point in terms of the neutral point in this sense. I mean, the point at which somebody wouldn't either gain or lose, obviously that would push it in a certain direction. If people were going to get a rebate as well, then clearly more people would be penalised in terms of those who had low energy efficient homes. But that is a variant which is attractive to some people. It wouldn't have to be taken on board as part of this, but it is a variant which would offer another incentive for people to improve the energy efficiency of their homes. Now, I'm told that, well, I know that the Sustainable Housing Strategy is coming out imminently, and I'm told that the draft version does have as one of its main outcomes that there should be a market premium on warm, high-quality, low-carbon homes. So I hope the Cabinet Secretary doesn't now go and delete that particular outcome from the draft strategy, but clearly what I am proposing is an important contribution to placing a market premium on warm, high-quality, low-carbon homes. So I hope that the Cabinet Secretary will consider it very seriously.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Malcolm. Just wonder if you can move that.
I move Amendment 33.
Okay. Now, a few people wish to speak. I'd like to welcome Mike McMahon to the committee.
Our trouble this morning.
Indeed. The first person to follow that up will be John, to be followed by Jamie.
Thanks, Convener. And I think I'd want to speak against Amendments 33 and 34. I mean, clearly we all have sympathy with the aims of this, which is to make all houses more energy efficient. And I think my argument is just that this is the wrong way to go about it. The word neutrality was used overall, but within that, clearly, there are winners and there are losers. Some people would pay £1,000 or whatever more tax, other people would pay less. So it still is effectively an expenditure for the people that we are giving the £1,000 to. And I think my question is that really the best way of using that £1,000? I think if somebody's buying a house for £200,000, whether or not it's an extra 1,000 is really not very material. On the other hand, if somebody is thinking about insulating their home or doing something else like that, then £1,000 is very material because it would be a larger proportion of the expenditure they were thinking about at that time. So my feeling is it is a very blunt instrument and we'd be better using either council tax or even direct grants as we've used in the past, because the figure that was mentioned was 0.5% on a £200,000 house. That's £1,000, which again I would suggest is major for a small investment, but is quite small if you're buying the whole house. I think my second argument against it is that it tends to be regressive, because we're assuming that at least some people at the bottom will not be paying LBTT at all, and so there would be no help whatsoever to these people. And frankly, coming from a constituency which is poorer, where quite a lot of the houses are a smaller value, I strongly resent the idea that richer people with bigger houses should be getting a subsidy and poorer people in smaller houses should not be getting a subsidy. And on top of that, the practicalities of a house does not change hands. There is absolutely no benefit and no change in the LBTT. So again, missing a lot of houses that need to be helped but aren't changing hands. I think the evidence we had at committee was that SDLT, which had a similar provision, had been very ineffective. And my final point would be that, this is the first tax we're going for in Scottish Parliament. Simplicity has been one of the key things which I think the Cabinet Secretary has argued and which I strongly believe in myself. And by bringing in these tiny little variations here and there, while they might be well-intentioned, we lose the bigger picture, we lose the simplicity that we're trying to aim for. Thank you.
Thank you. Jamie, to followed by Jean.
Thank you, Convener. Let me say, I began the process of considering this bill somewhat sympathetic to the notion that there could be some form of energy efficiency relief, and I agree entirely with Malcolm's perspective that the commitment to tackling climate change is shared across the board. But I'm somewhat unconvinced by these amendments. I'm not sure that they represent an effective measure. Clearly we had, and Malcolm himself referred to this, there is evidence that this is not a big issue for buyers, and notwithstanding Malcolm's comments, it isn't clear to me how this would change with these measures. We had evidence that the scheme that has been in place, that this doesn't necessarily seek to replicate but act as its successor to, hasn't been particularly successful, and I'm not clear that we have evidence that these measures would be successful in terms of what a scheme might look like, because of course, and one of my other concerns about these amendments is that there is no meat on the bones, as it were. We don't know what exactly has been proposed here. Is if one of the measures or the way to take forward was that someone invests in energy efficiency measures and then seeks to sell their home, I'm not clear of the efficacy of such a measure whereby someone who's invested the money doesn't themselves benefit and the buyer benefits, or if it's to be a retrospective application, as was suggested by Malcolm, in terms of a buyer putting in measures and then seeking to apply for a discount. I think that's pretty complicated, and I'm not clear how revenue neutrality could be achieved by that. And I go back to the point I made just a second ago. There is no prescriptive measure set out here. I'd be concerned about us passing an amendment that doesn't really set out what the measures would be. Malcolm said in his contribution we need to be concrete about what the amendments mean. We'll We can't be, because essentially it passes the job back to the Scottish Government. It isn't a concrete measure in that sense. So I thank Malcolm for bringing forward the amendments. I think it is useful to have this as a debate, but I'm not persuaded by the amendments. Jane?
Thank you. I think really points have been made. I too was sympathetic to this, and particularly slightly frustrated in some of the evidence that we got, that it couldn't have been sharper and clearer and better at the time. So I kind of want to see this, but I agree. I think it's just the wrong place now. I mean, land building transfer tax is just not a phrase on everybody's lips, and if we're really to appeal and raise the awareness of climate change and house insulation and better building and so on, I don't think this is the place to do it. So I really feel it's not. It's not really about the detail of it. I just think I would much rather see this debated in council tax and other places that will really mean something to everybody in the street, not just those that happen to be buying or selling a house.
Michael?
Just to make a point, convener, that I hear all the arguments that have been made counter to the amendment, and I think there's a lot of validity in that, because it's a very technical thing that's been introduced, but it seems to be in a very simple forum. But I think in principle it's the right thing to try and do, because having heard the evidence about incentivising people to think about energy efficiency in their homes, in the absence of anything in any other legislation, then this is the vehicle that's available to do this. And I think it's worthy of considering the amendment on the basis that it might not be perfect, but if at least it gets agreement just now, it could be further amended to make it fit the concerns that other colleagues have, because I don't see any other vehicle coming forward in the near future which would put all of the points in that colleagues have made, in order to try and get us to a place where, when people do come to consider house purchases, the energy efficiency becomes much more of a high profile, and then clearly the evidence that we heard suggested that it currently is.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. Can I thank Mr Chisholm for bringing forward these amendments, both of which are intended to introduce a regulation-making power to the bill that allows for the amount of LBTT to be paid on residential property transactions to be varied on the basis of how an individual property compares with the average energy efficiency rating for housing in Scotland. The proposal has been advanced by the existing Homes Alliance, and my officials have met with the proposers to consider the issues. Mr Chisholm made the point, as have a number of members of the committee, of the importance of taking steps to improve energy efficiency within the housing stock. The government is entirely supportive of this process and has taken a number of steps to do so. Whilst it is important to examine all legislative instruments to determine if any measures can be taken forward, it is vital to assess what impact any proposed measures may actually have. In this bill, there is a balance to be struck between the need for a simple, certain and efficient tax system and the likely improvements to energy efficiency that would flow from the change proposed to calculating the tax liability on the sale of residential property. Far from providing more simplicity and certainty, these amendments would in fact add complexity and uncertainty to the tax. No house buyer would be in a position where they know at the outset how much tax would be payable for a house of a particular value. Additional information would be required in order to calculate the liability. The information may change over time, and for every house sale would have to be verified carefully to ensure that the tax was calculated accurately. Aside of the administrative complexity, the proposal would have no effect whatsoever on housing for the nil rate band of the tax, one of the points that Mr Mason made. In 2011, there were 1.9 million privately owned dwellings in Scotland and 70,000 sales, representing 3.7% of the market. The Land and Buildings Transaction Tax consultation paper set out two scenarios to illustrate how a progressive tax might operate in the residential property market. In scenario 1, 70% of the housing market is excluded from the tax, which is because of the threshold that has been set. This means that the tax would apply to only 1.1% of the existing housing stock in any given year. This equates to 21,000 properties. Even if these figures were doubled to reflect a more active market condition, Land and Buildings Transaction Tax does not appear to me to represent an effective mechanism to influence the energy efficiency of the whole of the housing stock, which is the comparison with measures such as council tax and other such vehicles. The proposal would also have a number of disproportionate effects in the housing market. Owners of flats, for example, often find it very difficult to secure the agreement of other owners to undertaking any form of repairs and improvements. And these would be material to flats being able to be to secure a better SAP rating in terms of the energy assessment. In my view, it would be unfair to penalise owners or buyers of flats and listed buildings who would like to increase their EPC rating but find that they can't because of a lack of agreement. Flats comprise around 4 in 10 of Scotland's housing stock and 74% of the housing stock in the City of Glasgow. The scheme is intended to apply to every subsequent transaction of the same house. The tax benefit would therefore continue to accrue on houses where homeowners has undertaken no investment in energy efficiency measures. However, another owner may have implemented a number of improvements costing, for example, £5,000 to achieve a standard assessment procedure or SAP rating of, say, 60, but more tax would still be due on that property than if the scheme didn't exist. A rating of 60 can be very challenging for some fuels, such as LPG. More fundamentally, it is not clear that the proposal that underpins these amendments would have a direct positive impact on the energy efficiency of Scotland's housing stock. It is the seller of the house that undertakes energy efficiency measures, but the buyer of the house that incurs the tax benefit on the transaction. The proposal would therefore provide no direct incentive for additional energy efficiency measures to be introduced to Scotland's housing stock by the people who actually occupy properties. While I am entirely sympathetic to the desire to improve the energy efficiency of Scotland's housing stock and reaffirm the Government's determination to find additional ways to do this, I do not believe that the proposals in Amendment 33 and 34 contain the correct approach to achieve that aim.
Thank you. I ask Malcolm Chisholm to wind up and the press will withdraw his amendment.
Right. Well, thank people for their contributions. I mean, I think a lot of the responses are in the general territory of, well, it's not going to solve the whole problem. But of course, I was very keen to emphasise on more than one occasion that this was not a panacea. It would only be one of a whole range of measures. John Mason spoke first and said that, you know, he preferred direct grants. Well, I'm not sure if the Cabinet Secretary would, obviously we have lots of schemes at the moment and some are based on loans, but in effect, John Mason was proposing extra expenditure rather than the revenue neutral proposal that I'm coming forward. Having said that, I wouldn't, of course, object to direct grants to deal with the issue of people in the homes that are exempt from LBBT. I don't really accept the argument that it's regressive. I think there would have to be a cap on how much people could benefit from it in the larger homes. But the fact of the matter is it's the larger homes that do emit the most CO2, and it's there that the action is most urgent. The argument about simplicity was used by, I think, all the speakers, and I think it is actually fairly simple to implement on the basis that all homes have an energy performance certificate, and in fact, I think I said it could be calculated almost instantaneously by a computer as long as we know what the EPC is. So I don't really accept the argument about administrative complexity in relation to this. Jamie used the argument that I anticipated about the energy efficiency of a home not being a big issue for buyers, but in a sense part of the purpose of this proposal is to make it a bigger issue for buyers by making people financially aware of the consequences of the energy performance of a building. So I think the psychological effect is very important as well as the other effects of this proposal. Jamie also objected to the fact that there was no meat on the bones. Well, I mean, I think, you know, if this is introduced again, at the next stage, it may well be I can work up a more detailed, or somebody can help me to work up a more detailed amendment with all the details in. But in a sense, I preferred the simple version because it does allow a lot more flexibility for the government of the day to change the detail of it. It's the usual argument that's used by the government for proposing that detail is put in regulations, but certainly that issue can be addressed when it's subsequently debated at the next stage. I did try to put some of the meat on the bones by my illustrative examples, but clearly more of that could be provided if that helps Jamie Hepburn and others at the next stage. The Cabinet Secretary, in a sense, also used some of the arguments that his colleagues had done in relation to simplicity and the absence of an effect on housing with a nil rate band. I mean, I should add, not wanting to complicate things too much, but potentially in regulations you could actually offer an incentive for those homes as well within the system. Clearly that would mean that those with the low energy efficient larger homes were having to pay even more in terms of that, but potentially and theoretically there's no reason why you couldn't include those homes within the system if you wanted to. Flats was raised by John Swinney, and I'm certainly very conscious of that, having the constituency that I have, not to mention the fact that I've lived all my life in a flat. But I do think in general tenements have better energy efficiency ratings than standalone homes. I take the point about securing the agreement of owners, but the fact of the matter is, in order to achieve our climate change targets, we are going to have to do something about tenements, just as we have to do something about the housing stock as a whole. And the Cabinet Secretary also concluded with the idea that there was no incentive to sellers. Well, I would dispute that, because I do think the seller, apart from the obvious incentive that anyone has to reduce their fuel bills in relation to this proposal, the seller would be in a better position. The words market premium spring to mind again when he or she was selling the house, because they would have an advantage over other homes with lower energy efficiency ratings and might well both sell more quickly and achieve a higher price. So I don't believe that there is an absence of incentive for the seller of a home. So I do think this is a useful measure. To be honest, when it was first proposed to me a few weeks ago, I shared some of the concerns and indeed scepticism that people have voiced today. But the more I have thought about this, I do believe that it could make a useful contribution. Of course, it's not going to deal with all the issues. Jean Urquhart said that she would rather see the council tax measure. Well, we have a council tax measure. That's good. We should be seeing why it's not working more effectively. But the two are clearly not mutually exclusive. And while she said the LBBT was not a phrase on everyone's lips, well, at least not yet, because they don't even know what it stands for, most people. But the reality is, for anyone buying or selling a house, it is a phrase that will be on their lips. And I do believe that this is an appropriate and useful bill in which to introduce an energy efficiency measure. So I would seek to move seek to press. I've moved already. Seek to press both amendments.
Okay, well, the question is, Amendment 33 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
No.
No. We are not agreed. Therefore, all those in favour of Amendment 33, please raise their hands. All those against. The amendment is not agreed to. I call Amendment 34 in the name of Malcolm Chisholm, already debated with Amendment 33. Malcolm Chisholm, to move or not to move?
Move.
Are we all agreed? The question is that Amendment 34 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
No.
We are not agreed. All those in favour of Amendment 34, please raise your hands. All those against. The amendment is not agreed to. The question is that sections 28 and 29 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are all agreed. I call Amendment 19 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, group with Amendments 20, 21, 22 and 23. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 19 and speak to all amendments in the groups. Cabinet Secretary.
Convener, this group of 5 amendments set out the position with regard to when a land transaction involving a non-residential lease should be notified to the tax authority Amendment 20 is the substantial amendment in the group. It is couched in the negative and provides for 4 situations involving non-residential leases that are not notifiable land transactions. By implication, all other non-residential leases would be notifiable. Amendments 19, 21, 22 and 23 are consequential technical amendments that adjust the bill to fit in better with the style and approach of the new provisions brought forward by Amendment 20. I would move Amendment 19.
Okay, Cabinet Secretary, anything further? No, the question is that Amendment 19 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are all agreed. I call Amendments 20, 21, 22 and 23 all in the name of the Cabinet Secretary and all previously debated. And I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendments 20 to 23 en bloc.
Moved en bloc.
I'd like to ask if any member objects to a single question being put on Amendments 20 to 23. No one objects. Therefore, the question is that Amendments 20 to 23 are agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are all agreed. The question is that Section 30 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are all agreed. The question is that Sections 31 and 32 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. I call Amendment 24 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 12. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Formally moved, Convener.
The question is that Amendment 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. I call Amendment 25 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 12. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Move formally.
The question is that Amendment 25 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
The members have agreed. The question is that Section 33 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. The question is that Sections 34 to 39 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
I call Amendment 26 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, group with Amendments 27, 28 and 29. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 26 and speak to all amendments in this group.
Convener, to ensure prompt payment and to deliver administrative efficiencies, the bill requires tax agents to submit a complete tax return and pay any tax due before any application to Registers of Scotland in respect of the Land Register or Books of Council in session can be accepted. During the consultation on the proposals for land and buildings transaction tax, certain stakeholders raised concerns in relation to this proposal, based on the fact that in Scotland a buyer or tenant cannot obtain a real right over land or buildings until registration has taken place. Some stakeholders were concerned that this could create an unnecessary risk for buyers and that it might have unintended knock-on effects on third parties such as lenders. Following further discussions with the Law Society of Scotland, the Scottish Government believes that the arrangements satisfactory to the tax authority wording in section 44 of the bill, coupled with the introduction of advance notices under the Land Registration etc. Scotland Act 2012, will address these concerns. However, as currently drafted, there is a possibility that the provisions of the bill could be interpreted in such a way that someone who makes arrangements satisfactory to the tax authority could escape liability to pay tax if those arrangements fall through. This group of 4 technical amendments ensure that the fact that the tax authority can accept a return on the basis of there being arrangements in place to pay any tax due, or that Registers of Scotland can record a disposition on the same basis, does not affect the overall liability to pay. The effect of these amendments is to ensure that no tax avoidance activity could take place by relying on section 44. I would move Amendment 26.
Anything further, Cabinet Secretary?
No.
Wind up. The question is that Amendment 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. I call Amendment 27 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 26. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved formally.
The question is that Amendment 27 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. I call Amendment 28 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 26. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 28 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. The question is that Section 40 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
The question is that Sections 41 and 42 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. I call Amendment 29 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 26. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Formally moved, Convener.
The question is that Amendment 29 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. And the question is that Section 43 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are. Colleagues, that ends Stage 2 consideration of the bill for today. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for attendance today. Stage 2 proceedings will continue at the committee's next meeting a week today, 5th of June. And at the start of the meeting, the committee agreed to take the next item in private. I therefore close the public part of the meeting and we'll have a few minutes of recess to allow the public and the official report to leave.